Lawyer kicks woman out of the house for being unemployed years later. He sees her speech on the news. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Edward leaned back in his leather office chair, savoring the view from his high-rise corner office. The glow of success was almost tangible, filling him with a quiet pride. He had climbed the ladder faster than anyone in his firm, now regarded as one of the most talented attorneys in the city. Every late night, every sacrifice felt justified, and nothing, not a soul, would weigh him down, not even Emma. Her name brought a faint flicker of discomfort, one he quickly pushed aside. She had been his first real relationship, but she hadn't fit into his vision. She was warm-hearted, creative, and genuine, but she didn't have the ambition he valued. When the bills piled up, and her part-time job was no longer enough to keep her afloat, he had tried to nudge her toward change, encouraging her to find something better. But Emma had resisted, saying she needed more time to figure things out. In Edward's eyes, time was something he couldn't afford to waste. So he made the decision swiftly, with the detachment he was known for. Emma, he'd said one evening, we want different things. I can't stay tied to someone who isn't going anywhere. Her reaction had surprised him. She was silent, her eyes wide with disbelief, a wounded pride slowly surfacing. She hadn't begged or protested. Instead, she'd left without another word, only the barest tremble in her voice as she said goodbye. He watched her walk out, thinking she'd be fine, that someone like Emma would bounce back. But that was the last time he ever saw her. Edward barely thought about her after that, his life moving forward at breakneck speed. Soon, he had a string of prestigious clients, networking events to attend, and a reputation to uphold. Emma and whatever happened to her belonged to a past he had carefully buried. But the past has a way of resurrecting itself, often in the most unexpected forms. Years later, Edward's firm received an invitation from an organization called Voices of Resilience, a non-profit focused on empowering single mothers who had overcome homelessness. They sought corporate sponsors to fund initiatives that provided women with job training, housing assistance, and childcare resources. Edward's boss was particularly excited about this partnership, seeing it as an opportunity to elevate the firm's public image. As a representative of their corporate responsibility efforts, Edward was assigned to attend the upcoming media event. The day of the event arrived, and Edward dressed sharply as always. He was prepared for the routine of mingling and exchanging polite nods, expecting a smooth affair where he would only need to smile for a few photos and shake hands with influential figures. But as he walked into the room, he noticed something different. This wasn't just a networking event filled with polished executives. There were women here whose faces told stories of struggle, resilience, and fierce determination. Edward felt a small flicker of discomfort, one he couldn't quite place. As he moved around, his eyes fell upon the stage where a woman was being introduced as the keynote speaker. She was introduced with an air of respect, someone who had inspired countless women to rebuild their lives. Edward looked up, mildly intrigued. Then he froze. Had to be her. Time had softened her features but hadn't dulled her spirit. She stood on stage with the same quiet strength he remembered, but now she carried a confidence he had never seen before. She was stunning, poised in a way that took him aback. A hush fell over the crowd as she began to speak, her voice unwavering. Years ago I found myself alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. I'd lost my job and I had no family nearby. I was homeless, living day by day, struggling just to survive. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was fierce, her gaze scanning the room. Edward's pulse quickened, a gnawing feeling growing in his chest. Was she talking about him? Emma continued, her words laced with both pain and pride. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up. And I did it, not just for myself but for my daughter. She was my strength, my reason to keep going. Her eyes held a fierce glint as she said, no woman deserves to be abandoned or discarded because her circumstances aren't perfect. The audience was captivated, moved by her raw honesty. Edward felt his hands turn cold, a shock settling into his bones. Daughter. The word echoed in his mind. He tried to process the possibility. Could she mean his daughter? Emma's speech continued, a testament to the hardships she had endured and the strength it took to overcome them. She spoke of cold nights, empty pockets, and endless rejections. But she had fought through it all, fueled by an unbreakable bond with the child she carried. Her voice rose, gaining a fervor that resonated with every woman in the room. I stand here today not just as an advocate, but as proof that resilience can come from the darkest places. And my daughter. She is my greatest pride, the one who reminded me every day that I was worth more than the hardships thrown at me. Edward's mind was reeling. His daughter. He thought back to their last night together, a memory now muddied by guilt and shame. He hadn't known. Had she tried to reach him? Did she think he had turned his back on her even with a child on the way? Emma paused, her eyes meeting the crowd. Today, I want to remind everyone, especially those with the power to make a difference, that you can choose to lift others or watch them struggle. I hope this organization reminds us all to stand up for women in need and, most importantly, never to turn our backs on them. As applause erupted, Edward felt a churning in his stomach. Emma stepped off the stage, her presence electrifying, while he stood frozen. He had spent years building a reputation, climbing higher and higher, but in this moment it felt meaningless. All the power, the respect, it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. A sudden urgency filled him, an overwhelming need to confront the woman he had wronged, to see the daughter he never knew he had. He needed to know if he had truly severed any chance of reconciliation, or if there was still hope to mend what he had so recklessly broken. As Emma walked down the steps, she caught his gaze across the room, her expression unreadable. And in that moment, Edward knew his life would never be the same. The crowd buzzed with admiration as Emma left the stage. Women and men alike swarmed her, each one eager to shake her hand, congratulate her, and tell her how much her story had moved them. Edward watched from a distance, his mind racing, his body unwilling to move. He felt an odd sense of paralysis, a mix of guilt, shock, and the looming reality that his world was unraveling. He wanted to go up to her to say something, anything, but what could he say? She had been left homeless, abandoned, raising a child he hadn't known existed. Any word he spoke now would only undo his failure. But standing there doing nothing felt even worse. Before he could decide on his next move, a woman from the organization approached him, eager to discuss potential sponsorships and media coverage. Edward forced himself to nod and smile, making polite conversation, but his attention kept darting back to Emma. She was glowing, surrounded by people who saw her as a hero, a figure of resilience. And rightly so. She had become everything he'd failed to see in her years ago. She was ambitious, passionate, and unwavering. She was everything he'd believed she wasn't. Finally, as the crowd around her began to thin, Edward mustered the courage to approach her. She noticed him before he could say anything, her expression a mixture of surprise and guarded defiance. "Edward," she said, her voice flat, giving nothing away. "Emma," he replied, his voice betraying the tremor he felt. "Hey, I didn't know you were involved with this organization." Emma raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "Why would you?" she replied coolly. "It's not like we've stayed in touch." He swallowed, his throat dry. "Emma, he hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "Had no idea about her. Our daughter." Emma's expression remained stony, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of sincerity. "Would it have made a difference if you had known?" Her question cut deeper than he'd expected. He opened his mouth to answer but realized he didn't know the answer. The young man he'd been back then had been so focused on his career, on advancing and building a life for himself, that he hadn't considered anyone else's needs, least of all Emma's. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "But I want to know her now. I want to make it right." Emma's gaze hardened. "You can't just show up and expect things to be made right, Edward. You can't erase years of abandonment with a few words." A pang of shame twisted in his chest. He had been naive to think a simple apology could bridge the chasm he'd created. He searched for words that might convey his regret, his sorrow, but they felt inadequate in the face of her pain. Can I at least meet her?" he asked, his voice laden with a mixture of hope and fear. Emma crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You don't get to waltz in and disrupt her life, Edward. She's grown up with the knowledge that her father didn't want her. How do you think she'll react if you suddenly show up now?" The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always considered himself a man of integrity, someone who handled things with responsibility and respect. Yet here he was, realizing the extent of his failure, the depth of the hurt he'd caused to not only Emma but his own daughter. "Please," he implored, his voice breaking, "just tell me about her. Let me understand what I missed." Emma's expression softened for the briefest of moments, a flicker of empathy breaking through her hardened exterior. She took a deep breath, seemingly torn between anger and pity. "Her name is Lily," she said quietly, her voice carrying a hint of pride. "She's bright, curious, and strong-willed. Everything I ever hoped she'd be." Lily. The name felt foreign on his tongue, yet it stirred something within him, a longing he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He closed his eyes briefly, picturing a little girl with Emma's eyes and perhaps his own determination, a child who had grown up without his support, his love. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling hollow yet sincere, "for raising her, for giving her everything I didn't." Emma looked at him for a long time, as if weighing his words, searching for any semblance of remorse or change. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice tinged with both pride and bitterness. "I did it because she deserved a life of dignity, a life where she wouldn't feel like a burden." Edward's guilt swelled, the truth of her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. He had dismissed Emma as a distraction, someone who didn't fit into his ambitions. But in doing so, he had abandoned his own child, leaving her to grow up without a father's presence. "Emma, please," he said, struggling to keep his composure. "Let me be a part of her life. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try. I want to make amends." Emma's eyes held a flicker of pain, a glimpse of the wounds she had carried alone for so many years. She looked away, her gaze distant as if lost in a memory he couldn't reach. After a long pause she spoke, her tone cold yet resigned. "Lily knows about you, Edward. She knows you're the man who walked away, who left her before she was even born. She knows enough." The finality in her words left him speechless. He had always believed in second chances, in the idea that people could change and make things right. But now he was confronted with the reality that some wounds ran too deep, that some bridges were burned beyond repair. Emma sighed, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Look, I don't want to deny her the chance to know you, but that's her decision to make, not mine. You can't force your way into her life just because you suddenly feel regret. If she wants to meet you, I'll let her decide." Edward nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. It was more than he deserved, and he knew it. "Thank you," he murmured, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude and relief. Just then, a young girl approached Emma, her face lighting up with a smile as she reached for her hand. Edward's heart skipped a beat. She was about 11, with bright, intelligent eyes and a hint of shyness as she looked up at him. There was something about her that tugged at his heart. Perhaps it was the resemblance to Emma, or perhaps it was the way she looked at him with curiosity. "Lily," Emma said softly, her voice laced with tenderness. "This is Edward, a friend of mine." Lily's gaze shifted to him, her expression both innocent and inquisitive. "Hello," she said politely, giving him a small, cautious smile. Edward's chest tightened, a mixture of overwhelming joy and sorrow flooding his senses. This was his daughter, the child he had never known, the person he had abandoned before she'd even taken her first breath. He forced a smile, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Hello, Lily," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Lily looked at him for a moment, then turned back to Emma, her gaze filled with admiration. "Mom, can we go get some ice cream now?" Emma smiled, her face softening as she nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." Edward watched as they walked away, a sense of profound loss settling in his chest. He had spent years building a life of success and prestige, yet in this moment, he realized how hollow it all felt. He had wealth, influence, and respect, but he lacked the one thing that mattered most: a connection to his own child. As they disappeared into the crowd, Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to build a future where Lily might one day accept him. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew Emma's trust wouldn't come without effort. But for the first time in years, Edward felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild the bridge he had once so recklessly burned. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Edward. He threw himself into learning everything he could about single-parent families and the challenges they faced, particularly single mothers like Emma. He began volunteering at Voices of Resilience, not only to help the organization but also as a means to understand the life Emma had endured without him. It was humbling work, and he quickly realized how much he had taken his own privileges for granted. Seeing women who, like Emma, had survived hardship, poverty, and homelessness just to give their children a better future stirred something in him. Through his volunteer work, Edward crossed paths with Emma again. Though she remained wary of his intentions, she couldn't ignore his efforts. Edward's persistence was quiet and respectful. He didn't push to see Lily or demand Emma's forgiveness. Instead, he simply worked alongside her, allowing his actions to speak louder than any apology. One afternoon, as they finished sorting donated clothes, Emma finally broke the silence between them. "Why are you doing this, Edward?" she asked, her tone neither accusatory nor forgiving. It was a simple, honest question. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, his hands pausing over a stack of clothes. "Because I want to be someone Lily can be proud of," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want her to see that people can change." I can change." Emma looked at him, a hint of vulnerability breaking through her guarded demeanor. She seemed to be weighing his words, searching his face for any sign of deceit. "People don't change overnight," she said quietly. "It takes time and commitment." "I know," Edward replied, "and I'm willing to put in that time. For her, and for you." Emma's expression softened, though she didn't respond. The silence between them spoke volumes, an unspoken understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, he might be sincere. One evening, as Edward was wrapping up some work at the office, he received a text message from Emma. His heart leaped as he read the simple yet profound message. "Lily wants to meet you. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., the park by our house." Edward felt a surge of emotions, excitement, fear, and a strange kind of joy. He hardly slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities, rehearsing what he might say and worrying if Lily would even like him. By morning, he was a bundle of nerves but determined to make this meeting everything it needed to be. The next day, he arrived at the park early, dressed casually to avoid intimidating her. He spotted Emma and Lily near the swings, and his heart clenched as he watched them together. Emma was smiling, laughing at something Lily had said. Her eyes filled with a warmth he had missed all those years ago. Lily noticed him first, and she looked at him with that same cautious curiosity. Emma gave her a gentle nudge, encouraging her to go to him, and Lily took a few hesitant steps forward. "Hi, Lily," Edward greeted softly, his voice barely hiding his nerves. "It's nice to finally meet you." She tilted her head, studying him with a look that reminded him so much of Emma. "Are you really my dad?" she asked, her voice a mix of wonder and uncertainty. Edward swallowed, kneeling down to meet her eye level. "Yes, I am. I'm sorry I haven't been there for you before, but I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me." Lily glanced back at Emma, who gave her an encouraging nod. Slowly, Lily turned back to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Mom says you're really smart," she said, a hint of challenge in her tone. Edward chuckled, feeling a rush of warmth. "Well, I like to think so, but I think you might be even smarter." She giggled, a sound that filled him with a joy he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. They spent the afternoon together, talking and playing on the swings, with Emma watching from a distance, her expression unreadable. As the sun began to set, Lily ran back to Emma, leaving Edward standing there with a feeling of profound gratitude and hope. Emma approached him, her arms crossed, but her expression was softer than he'd ever seen. "She likes you," Emma admitted, a hint of reluctance in her tone. Edward exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. "I'm glad. Thank you for giving me this chance, Emma. I know it's more than I deserve." Emma looked at him for a long moment, as if finally seeing the man he had become. "I didn't do it for you, Edward," she replied quietly. "I did it for her. She deserves to know where she comes from, and she deserves the chance to have you in her life if she chooses to." He nodded, accepting her words with a newfound humility. "I understand. I just want you to know, I'll never walk away again from either of you." Emma's expression softened further, a glimmer of something like forgiveness in her eyes. She gave him a brief nod before calling Lily over. As they walked away together, Edward felt a sense of peace, knowing he had a long road ahead but one he was finally ready to face. For the first time in his life, he understood what it truly meant to be a father and a man, and he was determined to live up to it one step at a time. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.